Thanks, Diane. What we want to talk about today is the past, present, and future of the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes. I'm going to talk about the founding of the museum and its past history to where it exists now. Michelle will address the current state of the museum as far as its outreach to the community, and Doug's going to handle the future of the museum. But I'm also going to talk about the museum's connection to and preservation of the history of sailing in Canada, which is certainly my primary interest. As we mentioned, Doug is going to be actually, Michelle will be the second presenter. I'll be talking for about half an hour. Michelle's going to talk about her role in community involvement, and Doug's going to talk about the future plans for the museum. Needless to say, the museum has gone through some tumultuous times in the last 5 years. Being evicted from its property, having to move into storage. But there is very good news on the horizon with the reacquisition of the land by the museum. And so we'll be talking about that. And we'll be taking questions, obviously, at the end of the session as well. Now, everyone tells us not to put up writing on a PowerPoint and then read the writing at the same time everyone else is reading it, but we're going to do that right now because we want to talk about the mission and vision statements of the museum. The mission statement is to inspire an enduring connection to the maritime heritage of Kingston and the Great Lakes, and the vision is to be Canada's premier museum for experiencing and preserving the maritime legacy, past, present, and future of the largest interconnected bodies of fresh water in the world. The Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston is the only museum in Canada that is dedicated to preserving and presenting the history and heritage of the Canadian Great Lakes. And where is the museum located? I think most of you know that, but for those who don't, I just wanted to put this map on the screen showing the waterfront in Kingston and locating the Marine Museum right here, if you can see my cursor. And it's about a third of the way between the Kingston Yacht Club here and the Confederation Basin. And for the Queen's alumni in the audience, including myself, Queen's University is over here, of course. So the museum is located right in the heart of the Kingston waterfront, easy walking distance to the Yacht Club, easy walking distance from Confederation for visiting sailors to come and have a look at the museum. This is a drone shot of the museum property showing the dry dock, which is the predominant feature of the museum property. Our property line actually runs along this street here, all the way out through this water lot, across the front here, encompassing this entire water lot here, and then back to the street. So the museum somewhat sits kitty corners on this rectangular lot, and we have part of this water lot and all of this water lot available, and the entire part of what they call the East Pier here. And the plan is in the long term to possibly fill this area in here once we get a ship in the dry dock and increase our land development while maintaining this area as hopefully museum harbor, where we can use it for docking of historic vessels as well as community access to the water for kayaking and paddle boarding, etc., and educational studies. This is, by the way, the last undeveloped land on the Kingston waterfront, and the long-term plans of the museum is to develop this into a second-to-none maritime museum focused on Kingston and the Great Lakes. So where did it all start? The founding of the museum dates back to about 1975, when a group of divers were looking for a location to display the artifacts they found from their diving expeditions. Kingston is one of the top top dive sites, freshwater or saltwater, in North America because of the number of shipwrecks around Kingston, including the 103-gun St. Lawrence that was built at the end of the War of 1812. That wreck is available to divers, as well as many in the Kingston area. So they're looking for a place to display these findings, and the Marine Museum was the logical place to do it. And this founding date of 1975, by the way, in 2025, it'll come to the 50th anniversary of the founding of the museum. So we're looking for a big celebration in 2025. The museum itself, as I mentioned, is located on the historic site of the Kingston Dry Dock. The dry dock itself was declared a National Historic Site in 1986 and was completely restored in 2010. While the dry dock isn't the museum itself, it certainly is one of the major artifacts connected with the museum. It dates back to 1890. Before the development of the internal combustion engine, when steam power was the primary mode of locomotion for ships and trains, and for the pump to pump the water out of the dry dock. This is the pump house being built, and this is the stack, obviously. You can see the type of engineering involved in construction in 1890. The significance of the dry dock was it was opened by John A. Macdonald in 1890, which is the last official act before his death in 1891. So the dry dock itself is a very historic location for the museum. But that's not to underestimate its contribution to the industrial history of Kingston itself. The dry dock was an active site on the Kingston waterfront. And the Kingston waterfront, up till the 1960s and even 1970s, was a highly industrialized waterfront. This is the dry dock with a Canada Steamship Line freighter in having work done in the 1960s. Over here was the Kingston Locomotive Company, where they built locomotives. They have one actually on display by Confederation Basin even today. And you can see over here, there's warehouses and just industry choking the the Kingston waterfront. On this site, there were built 9 Canadian corvettes for the Royal Canadian Navy during World War II, 2 of which, HMCS Charlottetown and HMCS Trentonian, were lost in action on the North Atlantic. The dry dock was quite viable for building and repairing ships up to the late 1960s. With the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the expansion of the Welland Canal specifically, where lock size increased dramatically, the size of ships that were being used on the Great Lakes increased dramatically, and Kingston ceased being a transshipment point between Montreal and the rest of the Great Lakes. So in 1968, the manager of the dry dock appealed to Canada Steamship Lines to enlarge the dry dock to accommodate larger ships, but that request was turned down. So in 1968, the dry dock essentially was shut down as an industrial operation and sat idle till about 1974, when Honorable Flora MacDonald, member of House of Commons for Kingston and the Islands, authorized that the Department of Public Works would allow the dry dock to be used as a museum dedicated to the maritime history of the Great Lakes. That was in 1974. In 1976, on Canada Day, the Marine Museum opened its first public exhibit to the public, a gallery focused on a lot of the items discovered by the divers, of course, and of course the local history of Kingston, which had been a waterfront town for, well, ever since LaSalle encamped on that property at Fort Frontenac in the 1600s. In 1980, the board of directors undertook a major fundraising campaign to renovate and restore the shipyard buildings, with major help from the shipping industry itself, specifically through Dominion Marine Association, who was a major donor in refurbishing all these old, decaying industrial buildings. And the trustees were praised by the City Council of Kingston for the first steps towards the urban regeneration of a decayed industrial waterfront. And in 1982, the Marine Museum officially opened, and as I mentioned, it was declared a National Historic Site in 1986. So the museum Most of you, I think, had been to the museum when it was functioning on that site, and it boasts the largest single collection of Great Lakes historic material in Canada. Many of the collections are considered Canadian cultural property. It has over 4,000 artifacts in the collection. I should actually say 4,003, because I'll be talking about 3 recent additions. The library contains over 13,000 books on the history of freshwater shipping on the Great Lakes. It has over 50,000 ships' plans, the majority of which are from Canada Steamship Line's shipyards throughout Canada, including Collingwood and Thunder Bay, and of course Kingston itself. The pride of the collection, to my mind, of course, is the George Cuthbertson and CNC Yachts collections, along with George Hinterholer and TBF Benson drawing collections. But we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. There's 31,000 images, including paintings and drawings, and 3,500 linear feet of archival records in the archives. The most familiar part of the museum while I was up and running, of course, was the Big Red Ship, as it was called, the Alexander Henry. The Henry came into the museum's possession in 1985 and represented the largest of the museum's artifact. And it was quite a draw for the general public. When in surveys of visitors to the museum, one of the reasons people cited for attending the museum was the attraction of the Big Red Ship. And so it was quite a popular attraction. And Doug's going to be talking about future museum ships. I joined the museum board in 2012. Sometimes it feels like 2012, when the museum was going through a period of restructuring. A lot of its income, which was derived through the B&B activity of the Alexander Henry, had been shut down because of the large amount of asbestos that was on that ship. So it was going through some financial times, going through a period of reconstruction. The presidency of the board was taken over by Chris West, who to this day is still the president and the driving force behind the revitalization of the museum. The vice chair of the board is Brigadier General retired Serge Labbé. Serge keeps flitting off to Norway to take part in NATO exercises, and is now the #2 man. He's been recruited to be the #2 man for the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines in Ontario under General Hellier. So we won't be seeing him for quite a while. But the other members of this board, David Casson is still with us. John Plant, who is a retired commandant of RMC, is still with us. Doug, of course, the manager, myself, is still with us. Paul Banfield, who is the archivist for Queen's University, has recently left us to take over short-term position with the City of Kingston Heritage Department, and Neil Provan, the last person, has recently left. But the board has now grown to 14 people. 3 of the most notable additions are 3 dynamic women that we're quite excited to have on board. And the whole existing board can be seen on the Marine Museum website with all their autobiographies. And I have to say, if anybody's interested in serving on the museum, any museum committee or on the board, we'd be certainly happy to talk to you. Things are going well at the museum under this revitalized plan. Membership was increasing by about 15% every year. We had 2 very popular exhibits until about 2016, when the rug was pulled out from under the museum by the federal government, when the government decided to sell the property of the museum to a private developer. The property was actually offered to the province of Ontario for $1. Ontario turned it down. It was actually then offered to the city of Kingston for $1, and they turned it down for fear of the amount of remediation that had to be done to the property because of the decaying piers and the fact that it had been an industrial site, and they were worried about the amount of contamination. So they turned it down. So it was handed over to the private sector, and a real estate developer bought it and did nothing with it for 3 years until we acquired it back. The ship itself provided a challenge because one of the provisions in the lease that we had with the federal government, that if the property was sold, that we had 120 days to vacate, and the new owner of the property wanted to develop it into condos and apartments, and not so politely asked us to get off his property. So we were faced with what to do with the Alexander Henry. And I mentioned the amount of asbestos on that ship. It was an icebreaker. And so the entire hull had been lined with asbestos as insulation against the cold. And to break that ship up in sight, which is something we looked at, would have cost $300,000 to $400,000 just in remediation of the asbestos on board. We looked then actually sinking her as a dive site. And we got very positive input from the people who organized that. And the city of Kingston was quite keen on doing that as well, because they saw that as a future attraction. I mentioned the amount of diving that takes place, recreational diving, and they figured a dive site like the Alexander Henry would be quite popular. And before we were able to get that off the ground, the city of Thunder Bay contacted us because they were in the process of putting together a transportation museum, and they thought the Alexander Henry would be a perfect exhibit for them, since the ship was built in Thunder Bay in 1958. So we sold the ship to the city of Thunder Bay for, I think it was $1. They contracted a towing company, which was Toronto Dry Dock, actually in Toronto, to take the ship off our hands out of the dry dock and tow it up to Thunder Bay. And while all this was going on, I should actually mention that as a sidelight here, that when the museum was looking for a new home at the time, the city of Kingston was not being particularly cooperative. So a group of us approached the Hamilton Port Authority to see if they would be interested in taking on the museum. And we heard in the last presentation from the Toronto Brig, which is recently located at Hamilton, how cooperative the Hamilton Port Authority was in catering to their requirements. And I have to say they were equally cooperative in catering to ours. They gave us they offered us climate control storage for our archives in the old Westinghouse buildings in the industrial lands of Hamilton. They were actually located the site where we could actually locate a lake freighter on federal property on the lake strip. And we even had the transport trucks organized to bring the museum collections to Hamilton when the city of Kingston got wind of all this and decided that the last thing they wanted was to see their museum disappear to Hamilton. And so they became very cooperative and supplied all sorts of storage facilities in Kingston for the collections and a storefront operation for the museum in Portsmouth Olympic Harbor. So on top of having to dispose of the Alexander Henry, of course, we had to find places to store around Kingston all the archival material and the collections, and organize arrangements with local museums to take other collections on loan while we were getting reorganized. Here's a shot of the Alexander Henry under tow, or under push in this case. She was taken to Premier's Cove, where she sat for a couple of months before they organized her shipment up to Thunder Bay. And she's in Thunder Bay today, forming the nucleus of that transportation museum. So as I mentioned, the museum itself relocated to a storefront operation in Portsmouth Harbor, and that's where Doug Cowie is right now, and will be giving part of his presentation. And this is a shot of the interior. Before everyone signed on, we were talking about to Graham and Diane about these trail boards up here for the Canada Steamship Lines, but also notice a model of a Corvette indicating the past history of the museum as a shipbuilding industry during wartime, model of the Alexander Henry. And here, of course, is the model of Innisfree, which forms pride of place in the museum as well. The things started, as I mentioned, we were essentially in limbo from 1916 to 2019. In 2019, the future of the museum became exceptionally bright when Britt Smith, local Kingston philanthropist and our chief benefactor of the museum, donated the funds to the museum to purchase the land back from that developer who had done nothing with it for three years. The buildings had actually sat abandoned for 3 years and were falling into a state of decay and were heavily vandalized with theft of wire and plumbing, etc. And Doug's going to talk about more of that in his presentation. But what I want to focus on now is the amount of work the museum has done in promoting and preserving the history of sailing in Canada. And we're going to start way back in 1990. The first exhibit that I'm aware of that the museum mounted, this is before my time in the museum, was a presentation on Corinthian yachting in Canada. And I have to think that the impetus behind this presentation was George Cuthbertson, because in the 1990s, George actually was sitting on the board of the museum as a member of the board of directors. And Marie Smith, who was the curator of the museum at the time and has spoken to Shellback many times in the past, has a close connection with George through his wife, Ruth. Because Ruth used to be a draftsperson in the CNC design office in the 1970s when I was there as well. So the Cuthbertson collection and George's connection to the museum, it goes back a long way. And George himself donated his drawings to the museum, all his collections from his early youth to 1973. All those drawing collections were donated to George, by George to the museum. And the 1973 date is significant because that's when George stopped being chief designer for CNC Yachts and handed that responsibility over to Rob Ball, and George became president of CNC Yachts. But the collections were further hugely augmented when Tim Jackett of Tartan Marine donated the drawings that he had acquired from CNC Yachts when Tartan bought the assets of CNC in 1998. Tim filled his car with as many drawings as he could, which he pulled off out of the drawing cabinets that had been stored up in the mezzanine at Tartan Marine in Paynesville, Ohio. Filled up the car, drove to George's house in Lowville, passed all those drawings on to Marie Smith and myself, and they formed the basis of the collections of the CNC Yachts collections as opposed to the George Cuthbertson collection. And then subsequently after that, I drove to Paynesville to visit Tim and Tartan Marine and collected about 30 more rolls of drawings that Tim couldn't fit into his car of CNC designs, including Evergreen and the Mega 30. So the Cuthbertson and CNC collections form a very major part of the yachting legacy of the Marine Museum. And that was further augmented a few years ago when Richard Hinnerholer, on the left here, donated his father's, George Hinnerholer's, drawings to Maurice and myself at George Cuthbertson's condo on Guelph Line. I guess that was about 7 years ago. And previous to that, Marie Smith had discovered a number of TBF Benson drawings. TBF Benson was a Canadian designer in the 1920s. So the yachting collection at the museum is starting to become quite substantial. And in honor of that Cuthbertson and CNC connection to the Marine Museum, in 2012, the Marine Museum organized at the Royal Hamilton Yacht Club a CNC Yachts reunion and conference. The reunion took place on the Saturday night and involved about 125 past employees, I guess you could call them, of CNC Yachts, which included as many of the designers we could find, included many of the people off the shop floor, people from sales and marketing from all over North America. We had people coming in from Michigan, Rhode Island, people flew in from Manitoba, Rhode Island, and Florida, and we had English representation as well. This was an amazing cocktail party, just a gathering of old friends to celebrate everything that CNC stood for. And even in this photograph, you can see George and Helen Cuthbertson standing here with their daughter Jill and son John Kelly here. There's Ed Botterill, Don Green, there's Dick and Dirk Nulman over here, Mark Ellis, Danny and Martin Clacko over here. It was just an amazing gathering of old friends. That was on the Saturday night, and all day Sunday we had the CNC conference, which had 4 panels. We had a design panel of CNC designers, including George Cuthbertson, of course. We had a builders panel discussing all the aspects of the 3 different plants. We had the people from the custom shop, people from the production shop in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and people from the production shop in Rhode Island. Barry Carroll specifically, who came up to be part of this presentation. This photo here shows Marie Smith acting as the moderator, and over here, if you can see it, is David Weatherston asking a question to the building panel. It was an amazing group effort, and one of the important benefits of that gathering was Canadian Yachting, in the persons of Andy Adams and John Morris, videotaped interviews with a number of key CNC people. This is a photograph of Rob Ball being interviewed. And one of those videotape interviews came to light quite recently on Scuttlebutt. And if you follow Scuttlebutt, it's the sort of an online newsletter of everything's happening in the sailing industry. And they were actually commenting on celebrating the life of George Hazen. George Hazen was a member of CNC Yachts who went on to do remarkable things in the computer-based side of yacht design, including working with the US Navy. And George unfortunately passed away about 2 months ago from cancer. And Scuttlebutt found this interview of George Hazen from this evening and posted it as a tribute to him. And so all those interviews are available online and available to the museum. This whole connection with CNC Yachts culminated in 2014, when the museum mounted a major exhibit entitled The New Age of Sail, which celebrated the huge growth in sailing and sailboat building and design in Canada in the 1960s and 70s with the advent of fiberglass construction. It was the whole focus of the museum was how sailing had changed and expanded because of fiberglass. The 2 honorary co-curators for that exhibit were George Cuthbertson, of course, and Bruce Kirby, as being the 2 prominent Canadian designers involved in that whole growth at that time. And the exhibit featured videotaped brief snippets of presentations by both George and Bruce, talking about their that whole period of growth and expansion in yacht design and building. To inaugurate that exhibit, we had a large gala dinner at the Kingston Yacht Club, and the purpose of this dinner was to honor our 2 co-curators, Cuthbertson and Kirby. And a fitting honor, we thought, was to induct them both into the Canadian Sailing Hall of Fame. And this was the first sort of major public induction into the Hall of Fame. Hall of Fame had been developed in 2003, but with only one inductee at that time, and that was Paul Henderson. And so with this dinner, we reinvigorated the Hall of Fame by inducting George and Bruce as the 2nd and 3rd inductees. Prior to that dinner, we had a reception at the Marine Museum. And actually, we talked about those trail boards before. You can see them up here as part of that exhibit. And that gathering and that dinner was a gathering of some of the most remarkable people in the history of sailing in Canada ever assembled in one spot. Just in this photograph alone, you can see Paul Henderson over here. We can see George Cuthbertson and Bruce Kirby being welcomed by David Howard, 96-year-old David Howard, who actually inducted George. And David would go on to become an inductee of his own 4 years later at the age of 100 into the Hall of Fame. Here I am talking to Ian Bruce and Peter Milligan. This is my sister-in-law, Ron's wife, Pam, here. We have Don Green here talking to somebody, and Richard Hinnerhole and Dave Johnson, who was a member of the 14-foot Dinghy Hall of Fame. It was just an amazing gathering. Over here we have Peter Coors, who's just a recent past Commodore of Kingston Yacht Club. It was just a very remarkable evening. There's a shot of George and Bruce Kirby congratulating each other after the dinner. And I mentioned those videotapes of George and Bruce at the New Age of Sail exhibit, and those were professionally done. We scripted a number of questions for both George and Bruce. We got professional video photographers to do the interviews. This is the shot in George's home of the videographer setting up the shoot with two separate cameras and professional lighting and answering the questions that I was posing. And we drove down to row 8 in Connecticut and did the same thing with Ian Bruce. And the person that's doing the videography here is probably the best known marine photographer in North America, next to Sharon Green. His name's Guy Gurney, who has taken some remarkable marine photography over the last 30, 40 years. And he actually did photograph the interview with Kirby, and here I am ready to pose the questions. And all that videotape sits in raw form, waiting to be edited into something presentable. David Howard and Peter Milligard at the gala actually donated money to have that happen. And that was the seed money, but we're still sort of trying to collect money to make sure it does happen. In 2018, the Hall of Fame had its first major large induction, if you can call it that, where we inducted 14 members of the Hall of Fame. 14 additional individuals, including David Howard at the age of 100, Ian Bruce, who at the time unfortunately had passed away, Don Green, and the late Derek Hatfield, as well as all the silver and bronze medal 6 and 8 meter crews from the 1932 Olympics, who all represented Canada's first ever Olympic sailing medals. Here is a photograph of the inductees, Don Green and David Howard, as well as photograph of the relatives of the other inductees. That's myself there, of course. But this is Toby and Tracy Bruce, the daughters of Ian Bruce. Cedric Giles was there to represent his grandfather, George Giles, who was a member of the 8 meter crew in 1932. This is Tori Black, who is the sister Frank and Terry McLaughlin, who are going to be inducted in the very near future. And Tori happened to be the granddaughter-in-law of Jack Cribbs, who was part of the 6 meter crew in 1932. And this is Patty Ann Hatfield, the widow of Derek Hatfield. So that was the first major induction. One of the highlights of that induction was the last gathering of the Evergreen crew. Evergreen under Don Green, of course, won the Canada's Cup in 1978. Don was inducted into the Hall of Fame, not only for the Canada's Cup victory in 1978, but also for his work with the America's Cup campaigns with Canada, with True North in the 1980s. This is the designers and crew of Evergreen that were able to get together on that day. This was the last time they were able to do that because Don passed away the year after that. And that's one of the reasons for this type of event, of course, is to honor the people who have made such contributions to Canadian sailing while they're still with us. So currently there are 17 inductees into the Hall of Fame, with the most notable ones being, of course, Paul Henderson, George Cuthbertson, Bruce Kirby, David Howard, Don Green, Ian Bruce, Derek Hatfield, and of course the crew of the 1932 6 and 8 meter bronze and silver medalists from Royal Vancouver Yacht Club. We were going to schedule 14 more inductees for this year, this past October, but for obvious reasons, COVID-19 specifically, that's had to be delayed. And we're hoping we can do these inductions in October of this year. Fingers crossed that everyone gets vaccinated by that time, and things will have returned to some semblance of normal. And the inductees are going to include the 1972 bronze medalists John Eccles, David Miller, and Paul Cote sailing Solings in 1972. Terry McLaughlin, Everett Bastet, silver medalists from 1984 Olympics. Sandy McMillan, Andreas Josenhans, and Glenn Dexter, Soling world champions in 1978 and 1980. And of course, Steve Calder, Hans Fogg, John Kerr for their bronze medal in 1984, Karen Morch for her gold medal in the demonstration class of windsurfing in the 1984 Olympics, Terry Nielsen for his bronze medal in the 84 Olympics, and Lynn Waters for his lifetime of service to judging and sailing management in Canada and the US. And all these individuals, the majority of these individuals are automatic inductees, quote unquote, because of their Olympic gold medals, but each of them have contributed well beyond just those events. Terry McLaughlin and Hans Fogg being classic examples of people who have achieved greatness in sailing, even independently of their medal wins. And I mentioned Peter Milligan earlier. Red Jacket will be coming to the Marine Museum. Peter never considered himself owner of Red Jacket. He always considered himself custodian of Red Jacket. And in his will, he bequeathed Red Jacket to the Marine Museum. Nobody thought that we would be getting her as soon as we did, because with Peter's very untimely death 2 years ago, this legendary racing boat will become the property of the museum once the estate settles up Peter's rather large number of holdings, et cetera, et cetera. I say this, she was supposed to come to the museum last year, but again, because of COVID and because of the complications in the estate, we'll probably be receiving her this coming summer. She will, however, have to earn her keep once she arrives, because we don't have the money to actually preserve the yacht to the level to which she had become accustomed under the ownership of Paul Phelan and Peter Milligan. She went through a major refit in 2009, I think it was, $170,000 refit at the Bruckman shop by the son of the man who built her, actually. So we are putting a program together where she can actually start generating income. And another recent acquisition by the museum is this phenomenal 1949 Gravette International 14-foot dinghy designed by the great Charlie Burke. Dr. John Mills, who lives in Marion, Massachusetts, now has donated this boat to the museum. Dr. Mills was the original owner and the only owner of this boat in her, well, how many years of life? He has recently restored her and wants her to come to a home where she will be appreciated. And so we gladly accepted the donation. The boat still is in John's garage. You can see behind him there in Marion. We're still waiting for the border to open so we can actually go down to Massachusetts to pick it up. And a third donation that's come our way is from Steve Sewell, also of the Royal St. Lawrence Yacht Club, is this remarkable 1965 McCutcheon-built Kirby 3 International 14-foot dinghy, again in mint condition. Steve, like John Mills, is the original and only owner of this boat. He keeps it up as cottage now. And he wants it to go to the Marine Museum where it can be appreciated by present and future devotees of dinghy sailing. We hope to actually get up there this summer to pick it up and bring it to the museum. And we're wondering how many other vintage 14s are lurking up in cottage country as we speak, because Steve kept this boat as cottage when it became non-competitive, I guess, and sold it out of the cottage. And we expect there's dozens more of vintage International 14s lurking around up there that we want to get our hands on, or at least find out where they are. And one reason we want to do that, of course, is to register them in the new and upcoming Register of Historic Canadian Sailing Craft. And some of you in the audience, 3 people in particular that I know of, might recognize this vessel here, Pipe Dream. Margaret Mary and Joan Brennan have gracefully agreed that Pipe Dream will be an early entry into the Register of Historic Canadian Sailing Craft. And this will be a web-based registry that's going to document as many as we can, historic Canadian sailing craft that are still in existence. The criteria for the register is, of course, it has to be a sailing craft. It has to be still in existence, because we want to actually do this in order to preserve them. And it has to be Canadian designed, Canadian built, and or Canadian owned. The cutoff date to become a historic Canadian sailing craft is 50 years of age, which brings it back to anything built prior to 1970, 1971. And as somebody pointed out to me recently, that would make the Laser qualifying as a historic Canadian sailing craft. But in addition to Red Jacket and Pipe Dream, which will certainly be early entries in this web-based register, we're also going to include La Mouette, which was commissioned and built by Gordon Fisher and built by Eric Bruckman at Metro Marine in 1962. I think we've tracked her down through Derek Fisher in Annapolis. We're going to register her. We're going to register Laura, which was Cuthbertson design, built up in Georgian Bay, I think by Richardson's, which now sits at a mooring in Kerr Bay on Amherst Island, owned by a good friend of the museum. And all the R boats and all the P boats that have been all built, all the 6 meters and 8 meters, Tom Mulleran's Allen Ray will be included in this register. Amazingly, my own Corvette Trillium will be eligible for this register, as well as the steel CNC 35s and even CNC 27s will be eligible for the Register of Historic Sailing Craft. And again, the goal is to honor and preserve historic Canadian sailing craft that still exist in Canada, East Coast, West Coast, Great Lakes, across the country. So that's the end of my presentation on the past of the Canadian sailing, of the Marine Museum, the Great Lakes at Kingston. And we're going to hand this now over to Michelle, who's going to talk about the current outreach to the community that the museum is going through. And then Doug will take over and talking about the future of the museum, including perhaps a new museum ship. So Graham, I'm going to hit stop share here.
And yes, Michelle can take over now.
All right.
There we go. I hope everyone can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. And you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Brilliant. Right. So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you everyone for having us join this afternoon. It's always nice to be able to share what the museum is doing. And I think Rob providing that great background of where we came from. And so I hope today to be able to share a little bit about what we've been doing in terms of the present, especially in terms of community outreach and programs, because it's a huge part of the museum. So as Rob explained, in 2016, when the museum left its historic property and came to Portsmouth Olympic Harbor, we were faced with certainly a reduced situation, and that our gallery was cut in size, and we couldn't necessarily accommodate as many people into our space. And so the focus became very much on community outreach. We wanted to get back out into the community to really continue to connect the public with the maritime heritage of Kingston and the Great Lakes. And so that's been achieved in a number of different ways over the last few years. And when I came on board, there were a number of education programs set up for youth. The speaker series had been, I believe, in its second season. And we had a number of public events, programs like pop-up exhibits, as well as experiential tours that we were doing. And so when I came on board, it was an opportunity to really pick up where my predecessor had started and grow over the last couple of years. And so I just thought I'd share a little bit about what we've been doing, explain the situation pre-COVID, so you have a sense of the extent of the programs that we were doing and the community outreach we were doing, and then explain a little bit about what we've been doing the past year and what we hope to do in the next few years anyways. So I'm dealing with two screens. I'm gonna make sure both are working. There we go. So as I said, a lot of the community outreach we've been doing has to do with experiential tours. and one of which was a program called Get Wrecked, where we take people on in a dragon boat and paddle out to Garden Island to look at local shipwrecks. And for anyone who is from Kingston or has lived in Kingston, you might be aware of Garden Island, and it's a remarkable history as a timber wholesaler empire by the Calvin Company business from mid 19th century early into the early 20th century. And so if anyone has taken the ferry across to Wolfe Island, you may recall seeing Garden Island on your right heading to Wolfe Island. And in the little back bay of Garden Island is a shipwreck archaeological site that is home to over 20 shipwrecks that are all sitting in about 6 to 8, sometimes 10, 12 feet of water, depending on water levels that year. It's absolutely a remarkable little site. And so what we've put together is a tour that takes you over to Garden Island and gives you an opportunity to see the shipwrecks up close and talk a little bit about the history and significance of Garden Island to Kingston, to the Great Lakes and Canadian maritime heritage. I also mentioned that we have done pop-up exhibits, and pop-up exhibits are basically an exhibit that we take to public events. For instance, the photos that I have here are the Skeleton Park Arts Festival that is held every year, or usually held every year. And so this particular exhibit that we took was talking about local Great Lakes shipwrecks, specifically ones located around Kingston. And so we had a map that was set up with a couple profiles of different ships. We had an interactive aspect where we had photos of the shipwrecks and asking people to match the information, the clues they had about the shipwreck to the ship that was located on the main board, along with posters having to do with the history of scuba, or rather the history of diving, because scuba is just a piece of that history. And along with just efforts to preserve local shipwrecks and the impact of invasive species on underwater archaeology. And so these type of pop-up exhibits we like to take across to a number of different public events, like the Princess Street Promenade, education, school programs in the community. And over the course of the year, generally there's about 8 public events that we would take this kind of activity to. And we also try to make sure we always have a craft or an activity for the kids. In this case, we alternated between painting ships or ships or boats, as you can see in the top photo here. And we also had a sandbox that we took that year had to do a little bit more with archaeology. So they were digging for treasure and shipwrecks, which the kids found a lot of fun. I wish I was able to share that picture today, but I didn't have room. So that's, as I said, it's another opportunity we have to engage with the public in general. Now, I also mentioned youth programs, and this provides a snapshot of the programs we delivered in 2019. So just to give you an idea of the number of youth programs we delivered at local summer camps and schools. So over the course of the summer in 2019, we delivered 19 summer camp programs, 12 school programs to over 570 Kingston youth. And just as a comparison, from the previous year where we were getting into this community outreach, this actually almost doubles the numbers from the previous year. And so it was a huge accomplishment to be able to say that we had reached that many youth in the community and really get them invested in the narrative that we have to share, which covered everything from invasive species and water pollution on the Great Lakes to War of 1812, and I'm trying to think half the stuff we covered. We talked a little about life as a sailor and did some drama programs with Kingston youth. There was a lot of, actually there's a photo here of building boats. So we had the boat demonstrations and they had a lot of fun with that and exploring shipwrecks. And the sandbox photo actually is talking about travel on the Great Lakes. So learning how locks, ships use locks to travel through different waterways. And so they were building lock systems in a sandbox and testing it with water. It was a lot of fun. I have a video, but I don't have it here today. Now, that was 2019. 2020, of course, threw everybody's plans in the air, and we certainly had to adjust as well. Now, a couple of the ways that we did that was, of course, switching to virtual programs, virtual challenges. And early in the pandemic, we set up weekly challenges that we called virtual challenges on social media. and which were also circulated in our new museum blog that's for members and donors of the museum. It's a now bi-weekly publication that we send out with just a little update, some activities, and something fun to keep you going over the next 2 weeks. So one of the first things we did was a build a boat virtual challenge, where we basically send out to the community, we want you to build a boat using recycled materials and share it back with us. And that was the first one we did, and it received a lot of engagement. And as you can see here, some of the photos, people really got creative in terms of how they were building those boats and putting them together. And of course, they had to name them as well. As you can see, one of them is SS Mignot of Kingston, or the Jolly Roger, which was my contribution. But it was a great opportunity to really get the community involved really early on in the pandemic. And I'm sure we all recall it was trying times in the first few weeks, trying to socialize but not being able to socialize. And that was one way we have been doing that, and continue to do virtual challenges throughout the spring and a little bit into the summer. With people over the summer, with people getting out into the community, but also still wanting to keep that social distancing, we introduced a nautical scavenger hunt in August over the course of 2 weeks, where we had an easy challenge and a more difficult challenge that people could complete in the Kingston area. And basically sent them out with a list of clues. They had to go and take pictures or write down the answer to the question that we were asking them, submit it for a chance to enter a draw to win. We called it a night in package. So in partnership with a local escape room, Sherlock Escapes, and Capers Catering, we offered a night in package which was a virtual escape room for 6 and dinner for 6. In addition to actual activities and challenges, we have been doing on social media a weekly caption contest, which has been really a lot of fun, and I think enjoyable for our members that are able to send in captions to photos that we share with them the week prior. And so this one here just provides an example of an early one that we did. So throughout the pandemic is basically we're trying to maintain that contact as much as possible with the community. Over the course of the summer, we introduced virtual talks, and virtual talks are different from our nautical nights because they were just over lunchtime. They were basically about half an hour, 45 minutes. And there was an opportunity for us to reach out to a local community organization that was very much interested in the water and the maritime heritage as well, and provide an opportunity to ask them questions, get to know them, and for the community to ask them questions. So one we did is with Turtles Kingston. We called it, the first one was Turtle Talks. We had a second one in the September that followed up on that conversation. And really we were just talking about the impact of people and climate change and pollution on turtle populations in the local area. So it was a really, really great talk by Maeve and Armstrong. We did one with St. Lawrence 2 Brigantine and did a tour on board the vessel and had a chance to ask them questions. And we also did one with Swim Drink Fish. And if you know Swim Drink Fish, it's a waterkeeper organization that's more tied to the Great Lakes area, definitely Lake Ontario. And it is a partner organization of the museum. Over the summer, we offered them a lab space where they were doing water testing from a couple local beaches in Kingston. And they're very much advocating for swimmable, drinkable, fishable water. And so very much tie in with our current philosophy and plan for the future to become very much incorporating the environmental perspective into our narrative and making sure that that's as much a part of the conversation as social industrial history. And I know I recognize a number of names in the audience, so I know that many of you will be aware of our Nautical Night speaker series, which is now in its 4th season. Last year, it was partially held at Kingston Yacht Club. Because of the pandemic, we cut it short after 3 presentations. And it's traditionally held at the Kingston Yacht Club. We partner with the Kingston Yacht Club for this series. And with the pandemic, we cut it short, but we decided to offer a mini series in the autumn to replace the 3 that we missed. And the mini series in the autumn was focused on our Forged and Fire Kingston Goes to Sea project, which was a project that sought to share Kingston's maritime contribution to the Second World War and to commemorate the end of the Battle of the Atlantic and the Second World War. And so we had a presentation on Kingston's fighting corvettes by Roger Litweiler. We had a presentation by Sherry Pringle talking about women's contribution during the Second World War. And then I did a presentation on Grant MacDonald for the last part of it. With the success of the virtual presentations or format rather in the autumn, which actually reached an international audience, we had people joining us from all over the continent. We realized that this was a great format we could continue to use for our winter series, which is currently taking place. We had our first one 2 weeks ago with Jonathan Moore, who was talking about local shipwrecks and historic sites, so specifically the War of 1812 shipwrecks in Lake Ontario. And our second one continues this evening with Dr. Erica Barish talking about Lady Franklin and the Lost Franklin expedition. So so far it's been a great success. We've had a lot of people joining us from all over the place, and really great topics and speakers joining that series. And of course, I would be remiss not to include a feature on Rob Mazza, who will be joining us to talk about Red Jacket at the end of our series on the 7th of April. So we look forward to Rob's presentation, and we invite you to join us then as well. Any information about the series can be found on the website listed on the screen, which is basically marmuseum.ca/nautical nights. Another program that Doug's primarily been working on is the establishment of a Thousand Islands shipwreck tour in collaboration with Thousand Islands Cruises. As everyone knows, as Rob has identified, there are a number of shipwrecks in the local area, and this was an opportunity to reach a larger audience. So we were partnered with Thousand Islands Cruises, who operate cruises on Island Belle being one of them, to put together a shipwreck tour that would include a video component with interviews with local divers, would have some videos of local dive sites and perhaps artifacts, but certainly photographs of those sites that people could view while they were traveling over them. So unfortunately, not necessarily able to see below the water level. We don't have glass bottom boat at this point. It's certainly something for our wish list, but this was an opportunity for us to reach, as I said, a larger audience and really get people interested in the underwater archaeological sites in our local area. I'm just going to touch upon briefly about our website. If anyone has followed the Marine Museum website in the last couple of years, you'll know that we recently refreshed our website. It's been refurbished. We have a new platform layout, and this is very much a work in progress. The first phase was really very much just taking our old site, the material, updating it and putting it on a new platform. It's a new layout, new design. And I very much invite you to go and take a look and explore it a little bit more. I would say, again, it's still a work in progress. We have a number of different sections that are basically highlighting the important information we want you to know about. That includes information about current programs, how you can support us, along with information about our history, our future, and on there is also a link to our new strategic plan that I'm sure Doug will touch upon. Phase 2, which we're currently in, is all about providing access to our collections to the public. So focusing on that research tab on the website. And that includes bringing our online database, that includes the main database of artifacts, as well as our ship list in-house. It was previously being housed by Queen's University. They were hosting that platform, but we're bringing it in-house so we can manage it ourselves, and as well as updating the functionality and aesthetic of that particular part of the website. And just as an example, I can show you what is currently in progress. The ships list portion, and bear with me here while this updates. There we go. Would basically allow you to go into the ships list. This is going to look a bit different, but I wanted to show you the functionality and allow you to, for instance, go into the mills list and search by year. Let's pull it up. And it would put the filters of your search criteria into the fields and then click on one of the vessels. And what would open up is a small screen that would provide all the information about that vessel. And you could, the final version, our plan is to be able to, you can drag these little windows across and collect them up to about perhaps a maximum of 10, so that if you're doing research on a number of vessels, you can then open them at a later time and compare them. So there's a few tweaks that we're sorting out at the moment, but we hope for this part of it to be sorted out in the next couple of weeks, and we will be sharing that information out to the public. The second part of that will involve, focusing on the functionality of the main database, which allows you to go in and search by keyword at the moment and pull up any number of items that we have in our collection. So we want to make sure we increase the search functionality of that to improve search optimization and make it easier for you, the public, to look for artifacts in our collection. Part of phase 2 also touches upon what Rob was talking about in terms of the Canadian Sailing Hall of Fame, as well as the Register of Historic Vessels. That is a portion of the website that we are working on getting developed. It's going to take some time, so there's only so many hours in the day, but it is very much in progress and will be a part of the website. So it's a unique place on the website having to do with the Canadian Sailing Hall of Fame, Register for Historic Vessels, as well as the CNC Yachts collection and the Hinterholler collection. Everything sailing will be very much on the website, so you have access to that. Phase 3, which is actually part of which is already starting to happen based on needs of the museum, will include a blog feature. We are looking to incorporate a blog and news feature on the website that will provide monthly or bi-weekly blogs to the public on a number of different topics. Would include news about the museum that we can share out to the public. Along with a number of additional features. I have a whole list, a wish list of items to see on this website. It's just a matter of making it happen and finding the time. And that's over to you, Doug.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Rob and Michelle, for those 2 portions. First, let me just say how much I enjoyed the sea shanty that was at the beginning of your opening there. I think we'll have to use that at some point, because that was a lot of fun. And I bet it was also fun trying to find those sea shanties and choose which one to put up. They're always a lot of fun.
Just a little thought there. I went through, and I'd be happy to send it to you. I've created a PowerPoint for myself with each of those sea shanties in and where the links are. So,
well, they're great.
Yeah.
There's actually some groups out there too that we've been informed about that can come and sing those live, and I think we're gonna do that at some point. But to follow up with the program here, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the museum is currently planning as we prepare to move back to the Kingston dry dock property, which was our original museum site from 1976 to 2016. And the Kingston dry dock and what they also include as the Kingston shipyard is a National Historic Site. So the whole property is a National Historic Site, but in particular, the limestone dry dock and the limestone, what they call the engine house, which housed the massive pumps that were steam driven, that could apparently empty the whole dry dock in 72 minutes. And the boilers to drive the steam engines, and also the dynamo, what they call, or a generator is another term for it, which powered the shipyard because the shipyard had its own independent power source. But after being on that site for 40 years, in 2016, the federal government decided to sell the Kingston dry dock property to a local developer. This was in an effort basically to balance the books of the budget. And so the federal government was selling a lot of assets and liabilities throughout Canada at the time, and we were considered a liability, I guess, because we were costing them money, even though we had a long-term lease arrangement with them prior to that. And so in the end, a local developer did buy the property, and we were evicted by that developer. So we had to move all the collections into storage and set up a storefront gallery and office in the Portsmouth Olympic Harbor, where we are today. And I'm sure a lot of you have been to the what we call POH, and where Cork is also held every summer. And it's a great site, but we always wanted to return back to our original site. And in 2019, the city basically rejected the developer's plans to put up a huge 22-story high-rise on the West Pier, and then somehow shoehorn our property in as, you know, a condominium or office space. But as Rob mentioned earlier, those two piers are the last undeveloped property left on the Kingston waterfront, and the city just decided that they did not want that, and it didn't fit in with the planning that they had envisioned for the area. So the museum was lucky enough to purchase the property back in 2019 with the help of a generous benefactor, Britt Smith of Homestead. And we knew that the property had been left completely vacant and unattended for 3 years because the electric power was disconnected by the new owner, the local developer, which meant that the heating and air conditioning systems, as well as the lighting, were all shut down, as well as the health and safety systems like the fire alarm system, the sprinkler system, the security alarm system, the emergency lighting system, and the water supply to all the plumbing. The building was basically left abandoned without any monitoring in place whatsoever. And then to make matters worse, the front doors of the building were left unlocked for several months during the summer of 2019. So vagrants would wander in and sleep inside. And even some visitors looking for the original museum actually walked inside only to find a messy and empty lobby and no one in sight. People were actually calling us on the phone and asking, where is everybody? And we were saying, well, nobody's there. We're over here at POH. And we would send them back over to us. So it was really a sad situation. It was also around this time that we discovered that the building had been severely vandalized while left vacant for the purpose of removing all the copper, which could be sold at a scrap dealer for cash. All the heavy gauge electrical copper cables from the main panels to the mechanical room were cut out. What you're looking at right now, I'll go back to the other one earlier, the one before that. This is basically what we would walk into when we first walked into the museum from the entrance door for staff and everything. And all those white insulation padding that you see lying on the floor were insulation that covered copper piping that went to the heating and HVAC systems, air conditioning systems, and insulated the copper pipe. And so they cut out all that copper that went along in that room. And all the heavy gauge copper cables from the main panels in the next panel slide, Michelle, and the mechanical room were cut out, as well as all the supply cables to the 9 sub panels throughout the building. And all the copper pipes in the bathrooms were torn out of the walls, destroying some of the fixtures in the process. You could see that was a tile bathroom on the right-hand side and in the center, where they just took hammers and opened up the walls to tear out all the copper piping. And on the left side there, they're tearing out all the drywall so they can access whatever piping and electrical conduit is in the walls. And they would just randomly punch holes in the drywall looking for more pipe or copper wire, which had been removed. And some of the AC units and so forth were just flipped over and damaged in the process of removing the copper piping. So it was a huge mess that we walked into. And we knew we were buying this destruction, but it was a kind of as-is deal. So we had to either buy it as is or not buy it at all. So the owner of the property basically escaped all liability for the way he had just abandoned what was a heritage site. Eventually, the city of Kingston came along and said, you have to restore power so you have emergency lighting. And at this time, in the next slide, you'll see that we discovered that the sump pump for the engine house had been disconnected, which previously had kept the well for the primary steam engine to drive the sump pumps. And the two pumps, they were all submerged completely. That this well is about maybe 15 feet deep. And so what you're looking at there is the steam engine on the left-hand side with the yellow and red pipes going into it. You're looking at the head there. And everything in the engine house is, of course, original to the dry dock and is historic. Everything around in the white that you see is wood wainscoting that surrounds the well. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see this is the steamship. This the one previous.
All right.
That's the steam engine, the twin cylinder steam engine that drove the pumps. And you can see in the where the yellow pipe is going in, there's a water line on the wood flashing around the heads of the steam engine. And that's where the water came up to. So there was about 7 feet of water that had infiltrated through the walls around the well and completely submerged most of the steam engine and the other pump equipment. And basically filled completely up with water. And of course, that was like a big swimming pool, which created a lot of humidity inside the engine house. And with the net result of the basically mold and so forth covering all the wainscoting on the ceiling and on the walls and everything, which will all have to be cleaned up. We've done a lot of scrubbing to get it off, but we'll have to clean it up some more and repaint it. When all was said and told, we had the electrical and mechanical engineers come in and tour the damage. The cost of the repairs to bring all the systems back online was estimated at around $350,000 to $500,000, depending on how much damage is done to the heating and air conditioning systems over the last 4 years, because water was left in some of the systems, so it could have cracked when it expanded during the winter. And then, of course, all these systems sitting idle for 4 years is not good. And we'll just have to find out. We won't know until we put electricity to all these systems and power them up to find out if what damage has been done. So all very sad in the sense that it was also unnecessary. If they had just kept the power online and a little bit of heat in the building, and rather than just pulling the plug and walking away from it. The museum's therefore initiated a capital campaign, which we started last summer, to raise funds to repair the building. And we have raised enough funds to begin the electrical repairs. So the electricians are actually in there right now, putting in the main cabling to all the sub panels and in the mechanical room, which will first be done to energize all of the other things. And then once that's done, then we'll start to, put money into restoring the heating and the fire alarm system, the security systems and all that. If you want to contribute to this fund, you can go to our website and just type in the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes in your browser, and you'll see there's a window where you can contribute to the campaign to actually fund this capital campaign to restore the building to what it was before. And then that also will include some repainting, some drywall repairs, things like that. So if we get on schedule, we hope to reoccupy the building by late spring, early summer, and move the office furniture and the equipment down to the site, reopen the offices, the lobby, the public restrooms, and perhaps offer some interpretation of the site and begin some on-site programs focused on the historic dry dock and the engine house and the shipyard. We hope to install our first new exhibit, but we don't know. We're defining that now. It'll likely be a new sailing exhibit that showcases the museum, CNC, and Cuthbertson and Hinterholler collections, and also merge with some of the other projects Rob spoke of earlier. Perhaps culminating with a CNC rendezvous that may happen in Kingston in 2022. We're hoping that's a new idea we're hoping to promote and have here. The museum has a remarkable sailing collection that continues to grow, and we'd like to showcase that strength with more interpretation and programs to both recognize its historical significance and promote one of the great recreational industrial benefits of living around the Great Lakes, which is our greatest natural resource. So that's basically where we stand now. I'll talk a little bit more about the future, but first I want to talk about the idea of bringing a new museum ship to the museum called the Keewatin. As you may have known, we had the Alexander Henry before, and so we're looking for a new museum to replace the Henry, which we sent back to Thunder Bay, as Rob mentioned earlier. And the Keewatin currently resides in Port McNicoll. You might recall that the Alexander Henry was a 210-foot Canadian Coast Guard buoy tender and a small icebreaker that was donated to the museum in 1985. But when we had to leave in 2016, we couldn't leave the ship behind, so we gave it to another museum up there. If you go to the next slide, Michelle, you can see the Alexander Henry in the dry dock as it used to be. This was around 2009 when the concrete portion of the dry dock that you see to the north ahead of the ship was all completely rebuilt by a local developer, builder, Dornicamp, and everything that is surrounding the Alexander Henry is basically the original limestone portion of the dry dock. So it's incredibly, the limestone portion of the dry dock was completely intact to this day. And it does show some wear and tear in the surfaces from ice and so forth. But the concrete portion that was constructed back in the 1920s was completely crumbling away and dilapidated. so that before Public Works could sell the property in 2016, they had to come in and completely rebuild that concrete section. So we're hoping that lasts for a while because, the concrete techniques that they used in 2010 were a lot more advanced than what they did back in 1920. So you can see how much of the Alexander Henry fills the dry dock, being at 210 feet long. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the Keewatin is substantially longer and will in fact fill every inch of the dry dock, because the Keewatin is 350 feet long and the dry dock is 350 feet long as well. So it will shoehorn it in there basically. We have a little room to spare at the stern because the sill adds another 15 or so feet behind it. And but you can see that the Keewatin is actually longer than the museum. And the museum does not include that big structure behind. Yeah, that's a condominium. So if you put the pointer on the red brick portion there, that's the library and inner archives. And then everything going south is the rest of the building. And you can imagine when the Keewatin came through, it was built, of course, in Scotland. So when it came through the Welland Canal, it actually had to be cut in half. So they undid all the rivets and cut the ship in half to get through the canal, and then put it back together again in Buffalo. And I sometimes think that it would be easier if we could cut a section out of the Keewatin in the center to just shorten it up a little bit. And not many people would notice because there's so much repetition of rooms and so forth in the center of the ship, which you'll see in a couple of pictures that I have in the future there. But and just to shorten the ship up a little bit would help, but it's a big ship. So why is the museum interested in the Keewatin? The ship was commissioned by the Canadian Pacific Railroad in 1907 to be built in Glasgow, Scotland, for the purpose of linking the Eastern Railroad system to the Western transshipment port of Fort William, which is now Thunder Bay. The ship had a dual purpose of ferrying passengers primarily for the Eastern Railway Terminal in Port McNicoll to the Western Railway Terminal in Fort William. As on the return trip, it carried cargo in the lower cargo holds back east, which were distributed then by rail to Eastern Canada. So it provided a valuable transportation link between Eastern and Western Canada by helping populate the West and transporting Western cargo to the East. In fact, the Keewatin helped carry many Irish immigrants to the Western frontier during the early years of service. So it represents an important transportation story of the Great Lakes. In addition, the Keewatin represents the last Edwardian era passenger ship in existence. It was built 5 years before the Titanic. It therefore represents the heyday of steam-powered luxury passenger ships that steamed across the oceans and into the Great Lakes. Of course, the ocean liners were way too big to enter the Great Lakes. So the Keewatin is typical of a Great Lakes passenger ship that ran from the lakehead at Thunder Bay all the way down to St. Lawrence to Quebec City and Tadoussac. The Keewatin just went from Port McNicoll to the lakehead at Thunder Bay, whereas other steamship companies ran their passenger ships in different areas and different routes. In fact, some companies like Canada Steamship Lines actually built what they called their Great White Fleet of passenger ships, and actually built resort destinations like the Manoir Richelieu in the Charlevoix Valley, where passengers can disembark and have a vacation at the chateau before returning on another ship. Later in 1942, they rebuilt the Hotel Tadoussac further down the river to do the same thing. And in fact, the trail boards that Rob pointed out earlier, and which are behind my head here, up towards the ceiling, are off one of their passenger vessels called the St. Lawrence. So steamship passenger travel on the Great Lakes was a relatively exotic way to travel and tour Eastern Canada between the early 1900s and into the 1960s. But the era was beginning to wind down in the 1940s and 50s as people took the convenience of traveling in their cars. And as the highway system got improved, by the 1960s, the passenger ships disappeared and the Keewatin itself was retired in 1965. So when you realize that the Keewatin is the last remaining Edwardian era passenger ship in existence that still displays both the Western Canada immigration story and the grandeur of how ships were fitted out for luxury cruises, it represents a significant transportation story for the Great Lakes maritime history. Ironically, traveling the Great Lakes by cruise ships is becoming more popular again, as you're starting to see a whole slew of cruise ship companies begin to travel up and down the lakes, something that was stopped recently, of course, because of the pandemic, but I'm sure they'll fire that up again. And we're actually hoping to get cruise ships to come to Kingston as well. But you can see in the few slides that I've provided, in the next ones, the luxurious style of the ship, interior in the passenger area, the upper two decks, plus the passengers could relax on the upper hurricane deck. But the two lower cargo decks are totally isolated from the passengers, and that's where they hauled all the cargo. These pictures are from a survey that I did back in March of 2019. I was sorry, 2020, when I looked at the ship in March. And there's certainly much more exotic and good pictures to represent the ship, but to avoid any copyright problems, I just threw in some of the ones that I took during my survey. And you can see on the right there, that's the dining room, and all the furniture is covered in plastic to keep it clean. And then the upper left-hand corner there is the what they call the promenade deck. That's a whole section of rooms, and you can see the mahogany staircase going down one more deck to another passenger deck, and then on either side of the well there are rooms going up and down, and there was gold leaf paint on the stiles going up and down the handrails there and everything, all still in very good condition. And then you're seeing on the bottom left here, that's the wheelhouse, beautifully fitted out, lots of brass and bronze. And the Keewatin was the first ship to have radar, actually. So that's the radar you're looking into on the foreground there. And also on the, down here, I just want to point out in the dining room on the right-hand side, back one, it's got a vaulted ceiling, and all those panes, the little rectangular panes of glass that you see on both sides, but you can only see the right, are imported from Italy, and all engraved in colors, and they're just beautiful. And then all the interior woodwork is walnut, and so beautiful handcrafted walnut, and then a parquet floor on the bottom there. And then in the next slide, the Keewatin also has the distinction of having the only quadruple expansion steam engine, the only one of two that I've known to be built. Most steam engines didn't go up above what they call a triple expansion system. And so it's really unique. The engine's the one engine is massive. It rises about 3 stories high and powered by the 4 Scotch boilers that you see on the right there. And they've been cut open so visitors can see the rod system inside the boilers that actually heated up as they shoveled the coal into the furnaces. There were 4 of those. You're seeing 2 of them there side by side. And so they also supplied hot water to all the cabin sinks, which was a great luxury back in the 1900s. Every cabin had its own little sink with hot and cold running water. So we'll see if we acquire the Keewatin. We're in the middle of an application with Canadian Heritage to see if we can get the ship designated as Canadian cultural property. And if our application is approved, we have a good chance, but it's a long, arduous process. And which, if we get it, that would be great. Then it's designated, and we have a good chance of getting it from Port McNicoll. So that's enough on the Keewatin, which leaves me with concluding remarks about the museum's future. Beyond that, once we move back in this summer, we have the huge task of building a new museum, basically from scratch. We don't want to simply move back and install the same old exhibits we had before, even though 2 of the galleries we had just been updated before we had to leave, including the New Age of Sail exhibit Rob spoke of earlier. We'll have to develop a new interpretive plan for new exhibits, some of which will be dedicated to telling the story of the Great Lakes sailing and racing development and Canadian boat building that will highlight the collections of the CNC and Cuthbertson and Hinterholler collections that we have and our latest acquisition of Red Jacket. And we will kick off a new capital campaign, which will be much larger, in the millions of dollars, to fund the expansion of the museum building on the north side, not the historic south side part, but the north side. And this will give us more space for exhibits, but also more space to accommodate simpatico partnerships with organizations like the St. Lawrence Brigantine training vessel, and revenue generating areas for things like temporary exhibits, meeting and recreation reception spaces, an outdoor cafe, a gift shop, and so on. So we'll be posting more details on how those architectural plans are formulated in the future. But ideally, we want to create a cultural hub of activity based around our mission to inspire an enduring connection to Kingston and the Great Lakes, and have lots of activity outdoors for getting people connected with the Kingston waterfront and exposing the assets of the waterfront property that we have. And so in the meantime, you can view our 5-year strategic plan and our business plan on our website, which as Michelle is showing you right now, and which you could also make a donation to the museum if you like through that website. And that's my presentation, and I really thank everybody for attending, and we hope that you'll come visit us when we're back open and up and running. And thank you for coming.